Dave Pugh, who went with 25 of us to Stanford, is going to do he's been working on the whole history of the Vietnam War. And his talk today, pretty slide intensive, but it's a history of four streams of opposition to the war: active GI opposition, Vietnam vets against the war, civilian anti-war movement, and the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam and the people and government of North Vietnam.
The captions often will be self-explanatory, but this demonstrates how there's a very strong opposition to the war among Black GIs who see it as related to the civil rights movement and racial oppression in the US. Da Nang was a major Marine base where the 1st Marine battalions landed in 1965. Here's a Black Power flag they made in their spare time. This was discovered after an NVA North Vietnamese base camp was taken. And it shows that they were trying to make an appeal, particularly to Black GIs, to stop fighting. Now, this is an amazing shot. Engineers in the 101st Airborne carved out this peace sign right at division headquarters. There were actually combat refusals going on after 1968 in Tet, where the GIs would just refuse to fight. This John Kerry testifying, he fought in the Mekong Delta. These are friends of mine from Fort McClellan, Alabama. They put out a monthly newsletter called Left Face that some hippies in Atlanta helped them produce. And Dave is carrying a example of a full-page ad in the New York Times in November 1969, calling for immediate withdrawal. 1,365 with rank and serial number and base. A lot of this organizing happened at what's called coffee house, GI coffee houses outside of major military bases. By 71, there were 32. This is the best known coffee house, the Oleo Strut, outside Fort Hood, Texas. Now they're reading the new version of Fatigue Press, the monthly newspaper. This is from Fort Dix, New Jersey. Their coffee house was bombed by right-wing vigilantes. Here's another attack on a Marine coffee house in Oceanside, California, Camp Pendleton. Private Woodard just barely escaped with his life. The traditional pro-war holiday was Armed Forces Day, so the GI movement renamed it Armed Farces Day. And they had demonstrations all over the country in 1969 outside major bases. This is in GI Press Service, anti-war press. They got a picture of the war criminals. Didn't need a caption, really. This is my favorite cartoon. The officers are shooting on the enlisted men. Out now was Navy anti-war sailors in San Diego. This is one of the main ways that soldiers got news from the States. This is pretty early in 1966. They're trying to figure out what to do to save their lives and keep. This is 2 months after the first Marines landed in Da Nang. This is already being put on helmets. This is BBAW. This is a guerrilla theater where they simulated a search and destroy mission in Pennsylvania. And they handcuffed and blindfolded their friends, girlfriends, and they handed out leaflets to passersby to explain what was really going on. This is a war crimes tribunal that VVAW organized in Detroit. 92 combat veterans testified. Jane Fonda helped to raise money for it. She went on a speaking tour. A lot of people turned out to that VVAW War Crimes Tribunal because of this ad in Playboy. Hugh Hefner gave them a free page. This is a major, the biggest action from BVAW called Operation Dewey Canyon 13-3. These are iconic photos of 800 GIs tossing their medals and ribbons onto the steps of the Capitol. And the TV cameras were taking pictures. 3 years later, BVW attended the Republican National Convention. Here was a BVW vehicle from California with the flag of the National Liberation Front, who they didn't think was their enemy anymore. BVAW members blocking an avenue in Miami Beach. Here's 3 wheelchair paraplegic members of BVAW after they disrupted the National Convention. They got onto the floor when Nixon gave his acceptance speech. They shouted, "End the war, end the war." And Roger Mudd of CBS TV interviewed them there. And then the Republican security got rid of them. This is an example of 2 years later, BVAW made allies with industrial workers, miners, and radical students. It's a pretty big demonstration of 5,000. This is an early march of a Black contingent in an anti-war march. Muhammad Ali, he probably made the highest profile rejection of the war. The government stripped him of his heavyweight boxing title. This is Oakland Stop the Draft Week. There were many of us from Stanford STS were there, including myself. This is the Pentagon. Thousands of demonstrators were there. They're trying to block the entrance so no one could go into work. This is a picture of John McCain after he was shot down in 1967. These are famous photos of the National Guard shooting protesting students at Kent State, Ohio. The left-handed soldier did most of the shooting. And he was aiming direct. You see, he's aiming, right? Some of the other guardsmen have their rifles pointed up. He's aiming at the students. This is not well known, but in August 1970, 30,000 Chicanos turned out in LA to demonstrate against the war. Here's a famous picture of Jane Fonda. She visited in 1972 to document the bombing of the dikes on the Red River. She did a side trip in Hanoi. Her guides wanted her to sit on an inactive anti-aircraft gun, and she did so, which she later apologized for, because she said it could be misinterpreted that she wanted them to shoot down the American pilots. This is another very famous picture that same year, a 9-year-old girl after a napalm attack on her village. And Nick Oot, who happened to be on the scene, caught it. anti-war sentiments grew within the US Navy. And the USS Constellation was in San Diego getting ready to sail to Vietnam when anti-war demonstrators turned out to try to talk to the crew and to get them to stay. Joan Baez came down from the Bay Area to lend her star power. And you see the constellations in the background. Here's a picture of 130 mainly Black sailors voting to not reboard the ship. And this was called a dockside strike. Apparently Nixon saw these photos and went ballistic. This is going back to 1944 during the World War II. The Army OSS sent parachuted some of their officers into North Vietnam to train the Viet Minh, who was headed by Ho Chi Minh. The training was originally to be used against the Japanese, but when the war ended, the Viet Minh used the training against the French colonial troops. Here's another iconic photo. Malcolm Brown from AP caught this of a 66-year-old monk immolating himself in protest against the Diem government. This, more than anything else, convinced Americans who saw that something horrible was happening in Vietnam. Here we have the early form of waterboarding that South Vietnamese troops were using against NLF suspects. These are Air Force planes spraying Agent Orange, or supposedly just over as a herbicide, but it also poisoned millions of Vietnamese and even thousands of American soldiers. This is just a picture of captured Viet Cong guerrillas. Now, these are pictures of medical treatment facilities that the NLF set up near their tunnel network. At the beginning of Tet, a sapper squad of 19 NLF commandos broke into the US Embassy right in front of TV cameras and photographers. Here's another iconic photo. The general of the National Police executed a Viet Cong suspect, never got a trial, right in front of TV cameras. He didn't care. Okay, we're talking about the My Lai massacre in '68. A helicopter pilot, Hugh Thompson, and his crew were watching the massacre from above. They landed their helicopter and put themselves between the marauding troops and Vietnamese civilians and rescued them. This is a photo of the massacre that appeared a year later in a Cleveland newspaper. Okay, far to the north in Hue, the second biggest city of Vietnam, there were the NLF and the North Vietnamese captured almost the whole city. And there was a month-long battle for Hue that, again, the TV cameras were there to capture it. Back to 1920, here's Ho Chi Minh at age 30. He tried to make an appointment with President Wilson to ask for help getting independence for Vietnam, and Wilson wouldn't even see him. They showed him the door. So they had to go to the mountains. Here's Ho Chi Minh 25 years later with General Giap, the commander of the Vietnamese army. Okay, the Viet Minh was based in this area called the Viet Bac, which was 6 provinces in North Vietnam. And it was very mountainous and remote. There were no roads into it for the French troops, armored vehicles to go into it. And they could also retreat into China. In 63 here, this shows the kind of street resistance to the Diem regime. This is what the South Vietnamese troops were doing same year. This is on Con Son Island in the South China Sea. The Diem government threw thousands of political prisoners there, and the prisoners were chained and shackled beneath these gratings. If they said anything, lime was poured on them by the guards. Here, just to humanize who was leading the NLF, these guys had been architects and lawyers. I think Tho had been a lawyer, Phat had been an architect. This is another leader of the NLF whose family had been forced off by Bien Hoa Air when it was under construction as the largest US military airfield. And he led a platoon of sappers who broke into the airfield, destroyed or damaged 38 planes. This is just before the US landed the troops, because they clearly were losing the war. I like this. This X-ray machine was made in the USA. It's being used to treat wounded NLF soldiers. Nguyen Thi Dinh was probably the best known woman in the NLF. And on the right, she's training younger women to be guerrilla fighters. And because they were not tied down by their families yet, young women tended to be very good at warfare. This is in the Central Highlands near Laos, where there were a lot of tribal minorities. And the NLF created written languages for them to become literate, particularly to carry heavy weapons, mortars and heavy rifles. They NLF used elephants to carry these weapons. This is just a picture of how the guerrillas kept their spirits up under heavy bombing. US had superior firepower. This is in North Vietnam. Civilians are building individual air raid shelters so they can jump in them when they're walking down the sidewalk. This is an unusual picture. There weren't too many of them, of a US jet being shot down with the parachute and the pilot bailing out, right? You can see it. And here's one of these pilots. This is another iconic photo, which the North Vietnamese circulated around the world. It shows one of their women who's half the size of an American pilot. You can see who's in charge. This is during the retreat of the South Vietnamese army in 1975 from Da Nang. South Vietnamese civilians are scrambling to get onto these last helicopters. And some of the crew members are kicking them out. Sort of shows the desperation and the chaos. Now, there wasn't enough room on the US Navy ships for all the evacuation trips. So they had to actually throw over some of the helicopters into the sea Again, this was a famous photo. A North Vietnamese tank busting through the gates of the presidential palace. It's probably a staged photo. I also have a conclusion that explores the legacy of the Vietnam War in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I have 3 bonus appendices on Vietnam era music, Vietnam themed dramatic movies, Vietnam documentary films. So these are roadmaps for music who might want to explore these areas of Vietnam era culture. To receive any or all parts of my book in draft form, here's my email address.
How do you explain that the government, you've made the statement, but how do you explain the government has learned so little from Vietnam and has really just repeated that Vietnam mistake multiple times since the 60s?
Well, there's one explanation comes in one word, and that is imperialism. That the same imperial mindset exists in Washington and Wall Street. We have to be the world's policeman. So there've been thousands of American GIs sacrificed their lives in Iraq and Afghanistan in order to advance US strategic interests in the oil-rich Middle East. The only thing they've learned is not to send in 500,000 troops, but to let the Iraqi and Afghanistan soldiers do most of the fighting and dying.
This is Malcolm. Do you acknowledge any potential war crimes or torture on the part of the North Vietnamese in your book, or is it all one-sided on those items from the US?
Well, I think the issue of how prisoners were treated it's not well known in South Vietnam, and I'm not aware of much being written about it. But with the American pilots at the Hanoi Hilton, they were treated pretty roughly. You could say tortured in the first couple of years. But then the North Vietnamese saw that there was an anti-war movement growing around the world, and that they would be better served by treating the POWs well and letting the international press interview them to explain how they were being treated. And through that strategy, a number of, very much a minority of pilots actually came out against the war. And that was very embarrassing to the Nixon administration. We have to keep the war going to get POWs out, which is crazy. But that was, I don't know if you remember, that's what they were arguing.
Yeah. Jim Blake?
Thanks. I think there's no doubt that John McCain and others, the Hanoi Hilton, were tortured. Second point I want to make is some of us went to Stanford, and we're going to be having our 50th reunion a year late. And we get very self-congratulatory about all the good anti-war movement, anti-war stuff that was doing. And Dave's documented a lot of that. I would make my own point. Maybe he disagrees with this. I think there's no doubt that what won or the lost that war was the enormous, horrible sacrifices of the Vietnamese people, the NLF, and the North Vietnamese. It's true, American GIs, we lost, 58,000 American GIs? Terrible, terrible losses. The Vietnamese lost 2 to 3 million people. 13% of their country has been defoliated with Agent Orange. And if you go to the War Remnants Museum in downtown Saigon, the whole first floor talks about how 3 generations later, there are still Vietnamese children being born with birth defects from Agent Orange. So we should never lose sight of the huge huge sacrifices and pain and suffering that the Vietnamese, the army, their people. And there's a book that I read was written by a North Vietnamese soldier called The Sorrow of War by Bo Ninh. It was translated into English. This is a Vietnamese, North Vietnamese guy, not written for an American audience, about his war experiences. And it's just horrifying. So let's not forget what the Vietnamese went through. And I'm sure most of you haven't forgotten what the Vietnamese went through. Thanks, Dave.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, it's really inspiring. It's both tragic, but it's also inspiring that they were willing to stand up to really a genocidal war. You know, I mean, that was Westmoreland was all about. How many can we kill?
Right.
What's the body count? And the
Where's the
body count, it didn't matter if you were a combatant or a civilian, you were part of the body count. That was supposed to win the war. And then when that didn't work on the ground, then Nixon started the air war, which killed from a safe distance, mostly safe. So the North Vietnamese did figure out how to shoot down the B-52s.
It is a shameful part of our history, and I hope that we will learn more from it as we go forward if we haven't learned enough already.
Good point, Eric.
Thank you, David.